relevant structures on this model. First things first is figuring out which is anterior and posterior. The classic landmark is a big crack in the anterior half of the cord, midline, called the anterior median fissure. The problem is these models have big cracks on the posterior side too, so it's not reliable. So I would tell you something like this model is in the anatomic position, meaning this is anterior and this is posterior. These are two spinal cords, by the way. So this is anterior and this is posterior. The spinal cord, just like the brain, has gray matter and white matter, and it's arranged in a very specific and unique layout in both. And in the spinal cord, the gray matter is in the center of the cord, the internal part of the cord, and it's shaped like a butterfly. And it's shaped like this pretty much at all levels of the cord. It's a little bit different, but pretty much it looks like a butterfly, where there are kind of right and left wings, and this sort of bridge in the center called the gray commissures, which are the bridge between the right and the left gray matter. And if you divided the spinal cord into front and back halves, then you could see then you could talk about an anterior and a posterior half of the gray matter, and they're called horns. This is the anterior horn on the left, and this is the anterior horn on the right, and these are the posterior horns. This is an important boundary because in the anterior horn, the only information that is dealt with in the anterior horn is motor information, and posterior, only sensory information. So there are no cell bodies up here that are doing sensory duties. So that's kind of nice, and it's kind of nice to have that discrete boundary. So you figure out a way to remember that motor is anterior. Mama, move my muscles. I don't know. And posterior is sensory, like tapped me on the back, felt it on the back. I don't know, whatever. But sensory is posterior and it's anterior. There's a pinhole in the center of the spinal cord known as the central canal. It's continuous with the sort of chambers of the brain that contain the fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and that's what this model is showing us. Is inside this brain there are chambers, like underground caverns full of fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and this is how they're shaped. They have a really unique and weird and wild shape, and let's kind of pivot over here for a second, and I'll tell you about this because this system blends down into a little pinhole that continues down out of the brain and down through the whole spinal cord. These things are, these here are called the lateral ventricles. They're shaped like ram's horns, and there's one on the right and one on the left. And then in the midline, so these chambers, by the way, are called ventricles. Kind of like the heart chambers are called ventricles. A ventricle is like a room or a chamber. So these are the lateral ventricles. Then in the midline, there's two more ventricles. There's a third and a fourth ventricle. And the third and the fourth ventricle have a tunnel that connects them. It's called the cerebral aqueduct. So when you look on that list, you're going to see, under ventricles, you're going to see lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, and cerebral aqueduct are the things on our list. I think on that list it also says choroid plexi, which are collections of ependymal cells which make the cerebrospinal fluid, but I'm not going to point to these, but they're represented on here as these pink blobs. Those are the cells which make the fluid. I'm not going to ask you guys that on the test. So if you follow this this hollow chamber down, you'll notice that it narrows to this little pinhole, and that continues down all through the spinal cord as this central canal. And so that's the gray matter of the spinal cord and the ventricles. The white matter of the spinal cord is the external layer. It's the outer or more superficial layer. This is where axons are found. When you think of the four parts of the nerve, this is where the long axons are found that are covered in the white myelin, which is why this is white. And in here are cell bodies which do not have myelin covering, and that's why it's the color gray, although it's brown on all these models, which is painful. They couldn't have, all models and all anatomy textbooks and all the models, have you ever seen the color gray in the gray matter? It's always brown or beige. It's so painful, or pink. It's so painful. But just remember, this is white and the other one is gray. And let's see. As far as the, sort of the general layout and organization of the spinal cord, I think that might be about it. The white matter is known as tracts. There are discrete bundles of axons that all do the same thing, and those are given names, and they're called tracts. So the tracts run up and down the white matter of the spinal cord. The same meninges that cover the brain also cover the spinal cord. There's 3 layers: dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. They're the coverings of the spinal cord. They're not shown on this model. Posterior and anterior roots is basically part of the peripheral nervous system. We're going to just leave it for next unit, and we already talked about central canal. So that's kind of this model in a nutshell. We're here on this brain. What I have labeled, and this all falling apart, but 4 is the cerebellum. Cerebellum's really pretty distinct. It's usually a different color, and it's a totally different shape. The gyri of the cerebellum are basically these parallel straight lines, and the gyri of the cerebrum are these wrinkly, irregular lines, so it's really easy to tell the difference. And if you cut the cerebellum, the white matter of the cerebellum is shaped like a branching tree, and that's the arbor vitae, the tree of life. Here's the brainstem and the diencephalon, medulla, pons. Midbrain would be through here. This would be the structure known as the diencephalon, with the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus with the pineal gland. There's that pink bump will be the pineal gland. This is a bridge of white matter that connects the right and left halves of the cerebrum. It's called the corpus callosum. It looks like a bucket handle. Corpus callosum means, I think it means tough body when we Googled it, but it's the tough bridge that joins the two together. So that's what I'm pointing to in 6. The cerebrum is this wrinkly part of the brain that pretty much everyone thinks of when they think of the brain, and it's got the lobes that are named after the bones: occipital lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe. So if I pointed back here, exactly right. So this would be occipital lobe, frontal lobe, and stuff like that. When you look at it from a lateral view, the temporal lobe is pretty obvious because there's a fissure here that kind of separates it. The temporal lobe is this lateral sort of tongue or loop of brain tissue. It's all falling apart because the model comes apart. On the eye, the important parts of the eye for our lab exam are going to be 6 muscles that move the eye and move the gaze all around, like you can hold your head still and move your eyes. These muscles contracting is what lets us do that. They're innervated by some combination of 3 of the cranial nerves, so it's a little tricky. There is a muscle also that raises the eyelid, and the word for eyelid is palpebrae. And so you may have seen on the list the levator palpebrae superioris levitates or raises the superior eyelid or the upper eyelid, and it opens the eye. And I think there's 1, 2, 3 other miscellaneous things on our list, and it's the iris, which I think you already know. It's the pigmented, colorful part of the eye that, when you put on your driver's license, my eyes are brown. You're saying my iris is brown. The retina, I'll take this apart later because it's a pain in the butt, but the retina is the posterior and inner layer inside the eyeball that contains the receptors that pick up visual images of the sense of sight and carry it back and into this optic nerve. So in this model, this optic nerve is this white cord that exits the eye and is going through the optic canal, the sphenoid bone, and bound ultimately for the occipital lobe, where it's interpreted and processed. Iris, retina, optic nerve. I might be forgetting 1 or 2 things from the list, but those things are pretty easy. A lot of those you already know. For the muscles, I may use the chalkboard for a second and just kind of write, and I'll kind of show you how I organize it. And I think once you break it down, it's pretty easy to sink your teeth into and memorize. So there's 6 muscles that move the eye, but there's 3 cranial nerves that go to those. 2 of the muscles get their own nerve, and that leaves the one more. And that nerve gets all the other muscles, or you could say all the other muscles get that nerve. So the nerves are the 3rd cranial nerve, the 4th cranial nerve, and the 6th. 4 and 6 only have one muscle, and it's the and so for these eye muscles, there are 4 that are kind of in a compass position: north, south, east, or west and east. And there are these straight slips of muscles. These are the rectus muscles of the eye. Kind of like the rectus abdominis is a straight kind of band of muscle. These are a straight band, and their names are their anatomic position. So this is the superior rectus. There's an inferior rectus that if you look from above you can see it. There's a lateral rectus that's straight, and there's a medial rectus on the medial side. So once you kind of get your bearings, as I point to these straight muscles that are, at 12, 3, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or north, south, east, west, however you want to say it, it's pretty easy to name them. So if your choices were superior, lateral, medial, inferior rectus, which one would you give this exactly right? So that's a superior rectus. So there's 4 rectus muscles, and then there's 2 other ones. These are the oblique muscles. One is an inferior oblique that sort of cradles the eye like a hammock underneath it from side to side. And there's a superior oblique that travels along the superior and medial side of the orbital cavity, and it goes through this. This is a sling or like a pulley that the tendon actually goes through, and it swings around and then attaches to the eyeball. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls through this pulley, and it pulls the eye and twists it inward or in medially. And it also can move the eye in some other weird ways, but this is the superior oblique muscle, and as it goes through that pulley, then it attaches to the eye. So the word for pulley is trochlea. This is the superior oblique muscle, and it's innervated by a nerve called the trochlear nerve. So the trochlear nerve, or number 4, innervates one muscle on each side, and it's the superior oblique muscle, this one. This lateral rectus muscle, when it contracts, it tugs on the eye and it turns the eye away from the midline. It abducts the gaze. It's called lateral rectus, and its nerve is called the abducens nerve because it abducts the eyeball. So the 6th nerve is called abducens, and it innervates the lateral rectus.
So on your thing, are you gonna say with this muscle what nerve?
I could say what muscle is this, or I could say what nerve goes to this muscle. Or on the lecture exam, I could say, regarding the 6th nerve, what's its function? And the correct choice would be, voluntary motor commands to the lateral rectus muscle. All of those other muscles I told you about are innervated by the 3rd nerve. The 3rd nerve is known as oculomotor. It's a long name, but if you break it in half, it's oculo means eye, and motor means move. So all of these move the eye, but that's what that means. And this one innervates medial rectus, superior rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique. It also innervates the levator palpebrae superioris, which opens the eye. So one way to memorize this would be to learn that the 4th nerve, the trochlear nerve, gets that muscle, that the 6th nerve, the abducens nerve, gets that muscle, and then the 3rd one gets all the other ones. And like that. So that's a lot of stuff, but if you can make a table like this and kind of make it while you're looking at a picture or video of a model like that, and you just kind of write it out a few times over the weekend. Or if you do that as a part of a long table with all the cranial nerves, then I think you'll be able to memorize it. And we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it again in class today. But to be able to write out a table